A lot of infrastructure work gets easier right around the moment it gets more opinionated. Private connectivity becomes a product. Cluster networking becomes a managed default. Ingress migrations stop being optional. Observability config starts acting like a real standard. And the old we'll patch that next sprint stuff still shows up in the lightning round, waiting to ruin somebody's week. That's the theme this week. The platform layer keeps absorbing work teams used to handroll, babysit, or quietly postpone. Sometimes that is great. Sometimes it is the platform telling you that your old defaults are running out of runway. Hey, I'm Brian Teller. I work in DevOps and SRE, and I run Teller's Tech. This is Ship It Weekly, where I filter the noise and focus on what actually changes how we run infrastructure and own reliability. Show notes and links are on shipitweekly.fm. If the show's been useful, follow it wherever you listen. Ratings help way more than they should. And if you want more signal between episodes, check out oncallbrief.com. The latest brief this week was heavy on breaking changes, security patches, and platform releases, and that definitely shaped this episode. We have 5 main stories today, then the lightning round, and we'll wrap with the human closer. We're starting with AWS Interconnect going generally available, because this is a pretty clean signal that AWS wants private connectivity to feel a lot more like a managed cloud primitive and a lot less like a telecom product. Then Cloudflare Mesh, which feels like the private network for humans, services, and agents version of the same broader trend. After that, GitLab 19.0, because the move away from bundled Nginx, Ingress, and bundled data services is exactly the kind of breaking change platform teams actually have to plan around. And that one came straight out of this week's on-call brief. Then we've got EKS auto mode networking and what it means when AWS owns more of the cluster networking path for you. And finally, OpenTelemetry declarative config reaching stability, which is quieter than the others, but honestly kind of foundational. Story 1. AWS Interconnect is cloud networking getting productized harder. Let's start there. AWS Interconnect is now generally available, and the core pitch is pretty straightforward. AWS is offering managed network connectivity in 2 directions: multi-cloud connectivity between AWS and other cloud providers, and last mile connectivity between AWS and your on-prem or enterprise sites. AWS says that the service is turnkey, private, and designed to remove the usual infrastructure complexity from the customer side. The part that stood out to me is not just the feature list, it's the framing. This is AWS taking something that traditionally felt like network engineering plus vendor coordination plus waiting, and trying to turn it into a cloud service with a cleaner control surface. Multi-cloud starts with Google Cloud, Azure is coming later this year, and the traffic stays on private backbones instead of bouncing over the public internet. The last mile option launches in the US with Lumen. That matters because private connectivity has always been one of those areas where cloud teams and networking teams can end up speaking slightly different languages while the delivery timeline drags on forever. So when AWS starts saying, "We'll manage more of this path for you," that is not just a product launch. That is a platform boundary shifting. And I think the practical takeaway is pretty simple. If you run multi-cloud, hybrid, branch-heavy, or edge-ish environments, this is the kind of thing worth paying attention to early. Not because you need to adopt it tomorrow, but because it changes the default expectation of how painful private connectivity is supposed to be. Story 2. Cloudflare Mesh is basically saying private networking should include agents now. Next up, Cloudflare Mesh. Cloudflare launched Mesh as a private networking layer for users, nodes, agents, and workers. Their pitch is that the client on private networks are no longer just humans and services. Now they're also autonomous agents that need scoped access to internal APIs, databases, and other private systems without exposing those systems to the public internet. And honestly, I think that framing lands. Because this is one of the first times I've seen a big networking security vendor say out loud that agent traffic is not just a cute add-on to existing access models. Cloudflare is treating it as a first-class access pattern, Mesh plugs into Cloudflare 1, applies existing gateway, access, and posture policies, and ties into workers' VPCs so workers, durable objects, and agent workloads can reach private infrastructure directly. The interesting part is that this is not being sold like a traditional VPN replacement story. It is more like your private network should already know how to deal with services, laptops, remote servers, and agent style workloads on the same fabric. Cloudflare also says mesh is many to many private networking over its global network, not a collection of one off tunnels glued together. So, the bigger read for me is this: networking vendors are starting to assume the future client is sometimes a human, sometimes a workload, and sometimes an agent acting semi autonomously. If that assumption keeps spreading, private access tooling is going to look a lot more like policy driven platform plumbing and a lot less like old school remote access. Story 3: GitLab 19.0 is what real platform migration pressure looks like. Now to GitLab. This week's on call brief highlighted GitLab 19.0, and I think it is a really good platform story because it is not flashy at all. It is just the kind of change that forces actual planning. GitLab says 19.0 includes 15 breaking changes, and one of the big ones for self managed Helm users is that bundled Nginx ingress is being replaced by Gateway API with Envoy Gateway as the default. GitLab says Nginx ingress hit end of life in March 2026, though it can still be explicitly re enabled until removal in 20.0. That alone is enough to matter. But then there is the second punch. GitLab is also removing bundled Postgres SQL, Redis, and MinIO from the Helm chart and operator path, with no replacement, citing licensing, maintenance, and image availability issues. This is the exact kind of story that feels just operational until you are the team that has to sequence the migration. Because these are not cosmetic defaults. These are parts of the install path that people absolutely built around, especially in test, POC, or smaller self managed setups. And now the platform is basically saying that convenience path was temporary. So the takeaway here is not just GitLab changed some things. It is that platform teams need to notice when a project's default architecture starts growing up past its old bundled assumptions. Gateway API is not just a new thing to learn. For some teams, it is now the road forward whether they wanted a migration project or not. Story 4: EKS Auto Mode Networking is AWS trying to make cluster networking feel less handmade. Next up, EKS Auto Mode. AWS published a good breakdown this week of how EKS Auto Mode handles networking. And the story is really about ownership. Auto Mode sets up the VPC CNI for you, manages DNS as a core component, supports node level DNS caching, and lets you request ALBs and NLBs through native Kubernetes resources without a separate load balancer controller. AWS also says it handles CNI lifecycle management as part of the cluster maintenance. That is a pretty meaningful bundle of responsibility, because cluster networking is one of those areas where teams can spend years carrying around a bunch of, well, this is just how our cluster works, setup that is really a mix of controllers, tuning, upgrades, and networking assumptions nobody wants to touch during business hours. What AWS is doing here is making a stronger argument that for a lot of teams, that should stop being custom glue. Pods get VPC IPs directly. Traffic follows normal VPC route tables. You use AWS native networking services and tools you already know. And AWS is taking more responsibility for keeping the CNI path current and sane. Now, that trade is not going to be for everybody. Some teams want the flexibility. Some teams need the knobs. Some teams have enough scar tissue to be suspicious anytime a managed mode says trust us. Fair. But for a lot of orgs, the real risk is not lack of knobs. It is the pile of half-owned networking glue they already have. Story 5: OpenTelemetry declarative config getting stable is boring in the best way. Last main story: OpenTelemetry announced that key portions of its declarative configuration spec are now stable. That includes the JSON schema, YAML file representation, in-memory model, parsing and creation operations, and the OTel config file environment variable used to point SDKs at a config file. The blog also says implementations are currently available in C++, Go, Java, JavaScript, and PHP, with .NET and Python underway. I really like this one because observability configuration has had a lot of it depends energy for a long time. Environment variables everywhere, slightly different mental models across languages, lots of power, not always a lot of consistency. So when OpenTelemetry says the declarative config model is stable and should increasingly be treated as a first-class UX surface, that is real platform maturity. They even say the future process should be declarative configuration first, and that older environment variable patterns that do not interoperate well may get deprecated over time. That does not make for a flashy headline, but it does make life better for platform teams that want more consistency across languages and services without every team inventing its own telemetry setup philosophy. And honestly, that is a very DevOps story. Not exciting in the launch demo sense, but very exciting in the maybe we stop relearning config drift in 5 languages sense. A few quick ones before we wrap. Containerd pushed security releases across supported branches, including 1.7.31, 2.0.8, 2.1.7, and 2.2.3 to address CVE 2026-35469. The release notes describe it as a SPDY stream issue and call out hardening around sanitization errors before returning them over gRPC to prevent possible credential leaks in pod events. Patch this one. GitHub also launched Code Security Risk Assessment for organizations. GitHub says org admins and security managers can run a free assessment to review code vulnerabilities across their org. And the docs say it scans up to 20 repositories and reports severity and autofix eligible findings. That is a pretty decent quick win tool if you want a fast read on exposure without building a whole campaign around it. And AWS published guidance on secure AI agent access patterns using MCP. Their framing is that IAM has to become the authorization layer for these non-deterministic systems, because coding assistants and agents choose tools at runtime and can act at machine speed. That is a good reminder that it's just an assistant stops being true the second it has real permissions. I think the cleanest closer for this one is pretty simple. Infrastructure keeps moving from assembled to opinionated. Private connectivity gets wrapped as a managed service. Private networking gets redesigned around workloads, agents, and not just people. Kubernetes install paths grow out of old bundled defaults. Cluster networking becomes more provider owned. Observability config starts trying to look like an actual stable interface instead of a pile of toggles. And that shift cuts both ways. It can absolutely reduce toil. It can also remove some of the comfortable ambiguity teams used to hide inside. Because once the platform gives you a clearer default, you have to make a more conscious decision if you want to keep doing things the old, harder way. That is the human part of ops that shows up over and over. A lot of teams say they want simplicity. What they usually mean is they want someone else to own the painful complexity without taking away the escape hatches that they have grown attached to. Sometimes that works. Sometimes the industry just moves on and your migration project shows up whether you invited it or not. All right, that's it for this week of Ship It Weekly. Quick recap. AWS Interconnect going GA and pushing private connectivity further into managed service territory. Cloudflare Mesh building private networking for users, workloads, and agents. GitLab 19.0 forcing some real migration planning around Gateway API and bundled services. EKS auto mode networking making cluster networking less handmade. And OpenTelemetry declarative config getting stable in the kind of boring, foundational way that usually matters a lot later. Links and show notes are on shipitweekly.fm. You can also find the video versions on YouTube. And if you want more signal before the episode, check out oncallbrief.com. If this episode was useful, follow or subscribe wherever you listen. And send it to the person on your team who keeps having to explain that managed does not always mean simple, but it usually does mean the default architecture is changing whether people noticed or not. I'm Brian, and I'll see you next week.